Hey, what's up, everyone? We're back. The Daily Jace live show. How's everyone doing? Happy Tuesday. This week has been pretty mega on my end. There's a lot going on, especially with global games. We have our events next month, so hopefully we can run them. Fingers crossed. A lot of emails bouncing backwards and forwards with that. But earlier this week, I posted an article on my socials, and it was about the economy, and there was a very smart guy who was in one of the interviews in there, and my brother actually hit me up and said, I know that guy. So he said that I should try and get him on the show. So 48 hours later, we have him, which is awesome. So next bears are on me for the brother, but until then, I'd like to welcome to the stage Brad Olsen, Senior Economist at Infometrics. How you doing, mate?
Yeah, very well, thanks. Thanks for having me on the show.
No, it's neat to have you. I've seen a bit of you on the media. You're a very intelligent guy, and so the honour is all mine. Before we get into the crunchy stuff, just give a quick five for the viewers who may not know you, and about what you're about, where you come from, and what your background is.
Yes, I'm a senior economist at Infometrics. We're a private sector economic consultancy with a bit of a focus on looking at what is happening to regional and industry level economies. So we all know what's happening out nationally, but trying to dig in a bit deeper is what we focus on. I'm a 23-year-old economist, very young in the game, but trying to figure out what COVID means, but also how we can design or better design the economy for the future. Government keeps talking about rebuilding better. I'm trying to figure out what that rebuilding better might look like.
Awesome. Very impressive for a person of your age. So I guess the big question is, how big is this economic crisis that we keep hearing about? And have we faced anything like this before?
Look, it's absolutely huge, and I don't think we have faced something like this before, not in modern history. And the reason for that is because this COVID-19 it's a pandemic. Let's be very clear that it's a health crisis first and foremost. All of the other economic crises that New Zealand has faced in modern history have been generally some sort of financial or natural disaster shock. Now, they are a bit of a one-off. You look at the global financial crisis, you have a meltdown of the financial system. You bolster the financial system, it puts the money into the banks, things start to move again. The likes of a natural disaster, you take an earthquake or similar, an awful, devastating event, but eventually the shaking stops and you can start to rebuild. With a pandemic, that health focus remains such a key element, and that means the economic response is so much harder to look at. I mean, look, we closed down the New Zealand economy. We put it on life support for 4.5 weeks. We've never done that before. We've never even contemplated it. So that, I guess, underscores just how weird and wonderful this hit is. When we look again at how the economy's responded, I think businesses and people out there have thought that the economy was actually, took a hit during lockdown, but was starting to get going not too bad afterwards. Now, an element of that is true there, but at the same time, over the last few months, we've had 70,000 Kiwis who have lost their jobs in 4 months alone. During the global financial crisis, New Zealand lost about 65,000 jobs, and it took 21 months, and that was it. That was the end of it. We've done more than that in 4 months, and the pain has really only just now started to begin.
Yeah, right. So what in your mind is the solutions that we could come up with? Obviously, Labour and National, they'll have different slants at this, but what are the main rocks that we need to put in place?
Look, it's really tough moving ahead for businesses, because I think when you look out there, the main differences that you're seeing at the moment are also not exactly how an economy normally responds to a shock or a crisis. What we would normally expect to see is that people immediately cut staff. You have layoffs all across the country, you have businesses that close. We haven't actually seen that quite as much so far. What we've seen instead is that a lot of people are having to work fewer hours, that the boss says, look, you only can work 4 days this week, or you don't get that Saturday shift. But equally, and this is something we almost never see in the economy, we're seeing people have their pay rates be cut. People are taking a voluntary 10% pay cut for a certain amount of time. Now, what that means is that the policy responses have to be a bit different, but we've also, I think, got to remember that we're sort of not even finished the immediate response yet. And I say that because up until last Tuesday, everything was rolling along. Businesses were going a little bit happier. We'd got through lockdown. Things were back on track. And then we had this announcement, 9:15, the Prime Minister comes out, tells us that we've got community transmission in Auckland. That really, I think, upended things. And from a business point of view, that said to everyone, look, here, this is a reality check. Things are not back to normal. We can't exist without COVID. We have to realise that the risk of further outbreaks is possible. And that is, in my mind, going to be a really hard thing for businesses to grapple with. If you look at, so I'm in Wellington at the moment, you look out at businesses there, we're at level 2, but a lot of people are working from home. There's less activity in the cafes. There's not as many people going out for lunch. So the reverberations of how this moves its way through the economy is massive. And the other thing I think that people should be aware of, or we need to keep in mind through this, is that some of the key pillars of New Zealand's sort of economic picture have sort of been kicked out from under us. We used to bring in something like $16-17 billion a year from international tourists. That's gone. You've got international education. That was a $5 billion industry. Gone. You've got the global economy, which is in a real wrecked space at the moment. That means they're not going to want to buy as much of our premium wine or the fancy cuts of meat or anything. And so, again, some of our export market gets cut out. So the difficulties in moving the economy ahead are really tough. Now, you asked a question about what do we do about this from a political point of view. To a point, there's a lot the government can do in the immediate response. That's getting, wage subsidies and such in place. But there's equally a need for the government to just create the right settings. Confidence is key in an economic shock like this, and make sure that businesses feel like they can hire a new person, buy some new equipment, and make sure that consumers feel like they can actually go out and spend the money in their wallets. So there's an element of the government setting the right conditions and then letting people get on with it. Equally, with such a big shock, this is a 1 in 100 year event, we do need to try and kill as many birds with the same stone as possible. We have this big crisis, but we've also for 30 years or so had some massive issues in terms of skills mismatches. We haven't, you've got a bunch of people that have got these skills over here. You've got a bunch of employers that want a certain amount of skills and they don't cross over properly. So trying to, fix some of those issues becomes quite important. The final thing I'll say on that, I think, is that there's no good options for all of this. This is a pandemic. It's something that no one has grappled with for, generations. So I think when we look at the options on the table, none of them are great silver bullets to change the course of the economy. It's just trying to choose the least bad option.
Yeah, right. You had quite a few points there. So there was the point you made about how we have to attack this with different policy that we don't normally attack crisis with. What's different? You highlighted a lot of differences that the actual crisis entails, but what's going to change with the policy and how we come up with the next steps moving forward?
Yeah, and again, I think it depends on what phase we're in. So the likes of the wage, let's look at the wage subsidy for a second, because that's been huge. I mean, it's $13+ billion. That's an enormous amount of money that's being paid out by the government. At one stage, you had, I think it was 71% of businesses, a good 61% of every worker, or of all workers in New Zealand, were supported by the wage subsidy. I mean, the amount of government intervention there is just astounding. And I think what we need to realise there is that the wage subsidy was a great first move when we moved into lockdown. Things were moving at such rapid pace that if you hadn't provided support to businesses, a lot of them would have said, look, let's cut staff, let's get rid of them. A few weeks later, they would have gone, actually, things are all right, let's try and rehire them. But often by the time you've cut and then tried to rehire, you've already broken a lot of bonds in the labour market, and it's much more painful to rehire than it is to cut. So in the immediate response, what you had was the government saying, look, let's keep people on board, let's keep people getting paid, let's basically buy a little bit of breathing space, which is what you had. At the moment, though, as we continue to see the economic and the health situation evolve, you do wonder if a wage subsidy remains the best policy option moving forward. Look, if in 2 years' time we're still having community outbreaks every now and then, and we have to continue to put different regions into lockdown, is it really the best idea to say to businesses, look, just hold all your operations, stop doing business for 2 weeks, sit at home and we will just pay for you to do nothing. And now at the moment, again, it's worthwhile because you keep people employed, but longer term, you do wonder if actually we need to find a slightly more sustainable way of providing support. So instead of saying to businesses, just put all of your operations on ice, you say to them, look, we'll give you some funding to enable your business to operate at level 2 or operate at level 3. I think that those are some of the differences we're going to have to see as policy evolves. Government's going to have to get a little bit more, longer term in its thinking to understand what is a sustainable method of providing support that keeps people employed, but also means we get a return on the investment and the huge amount of debt that we're running up.
For sure, for sure. After the wage subsidy runs out, is it 3 weeks that we're away from the wage subsidy?
I think roughly.
Ending? Yeah, roughly. How many people do you think will be out of a job?
Well, look, I was a little bit stung, if you will, by the end of the main wage subsidy. At that point, again, we had 1 point-something million workers on the wage subsidy, and
Wow.
the surveys that had come out from one of the government departments said, look, businesses expect that they could cut 6% of their workforce that were on the subsidy. Now, at that point, that's where I was worried we were going to see sort of 120,000 Kiwis out of work by September, by the end of September. At the moment, again, mid-August, we've got 70-odd thousand. Now, that's still a huge amount of people, but it's not nearly as bad as we might have expected. So I think on one hand, you've got a lot of businesses who are probably doing better than they might have expected. So you might not have sort of this massive balloon of unemployment all at once. You will continue to see people laid off. I think what you're going to see, though, over the next, let's call it 6 months or so, is up until November, there'll be a steady trickle of unemployment coming through. Up until that point, a lot of businesses are just going to be making small adjustments. Come November, December, there's going to be some firms that go, look, we can't afford this. We're going to have to lay off staff. Other businesses, though, are going to say, look, we're coming into a busier than normal Christmas period, just because Christmas is always a good period for spending. We'll keep our staff on for that point. My worry is we get through to sort of January, February next year, those businesses say, look, we're about to enter a new financial year. We don't have the cash on hand. We just don't have the business. We need to cut. So essentially, we just keep pushing out the inevitable. You are going to see more people lose their jobs. And those are some of the jobs that you're just not going to see reappear. I don't expect that within 2 years' time, we're going to have a huge rush of people that are going to become employed in tourism, for example. I think some of those businesses will just completely be lost, and we'll see new businesses and new enterprises spring up in different parts of the economy. We've got to be realistic that that's quite painful, but is also the best option over the medium term to get New Zealand going again.
What sectors do you think will pop out of this then?
Look, I think that New Zealand does quite well when it comes to service sectors and particularly making sure that we've got good, what an economist will call intangibles, software and similar. You look at the likes of Xero and some of our other sort of tech companies that are doing great work, Weta Workshop and their digital creativity elements. Those areas, I think, are really ripe areas for additional development. They're good for productivity. We make, good money off them. And as well as that, I think we need to realise that Kiwis are a really nice bunch of people. And not only do we recognise that here, but across the world, they're well recognised. And so when we've got a lot of people like flight attendants, like cafe workers, like retail workers, who have a really good personable sort of manner, they have that person-to-person connection. How do we best utilise those skills to make sure that we are actually meeting demand across the world? So if you are selling a software product or similar, you're not only selling the product, you're selling that wraparound support. You can ring up and get your Kiwi staff member to help you set up a new worker or a new user to help you navigate the latest and greatest of your product. I think some of those changes are going to be really key for New Zealand to keep making money on the world stage, which is important from an economic point of view, but also to keep Kiwis employed in work that interests them and that you can actually earn a good wage from.
Yeah, right. thinking internationally, you talked about big numbers that we might lose in terms of cash coming into the country through tourism, through exporting, importing, all the rest of it. How much is that all worth, and how can we replace that income for the country?
Look, it's billions of dollars worth, and I think in some ways it's very difficult in the short term to make changes to figure out where you can sort of get that money back. New Zealanders are currently milking cows and creating there's animals going through the meatworks, there's wine bottles being sort of put together. All of those all of those products need to go somewhere. New Zealand's 5 million is just too small a population to absorb that. I think, though, what we do have to do on that global stage is recognise how the economy is shifting in the short term. We looked at some data from OpenTable across the global economy, and it shows that essentially over the last, I think it's few months, you've had restaurant bookings that have only returned to about 50% of their normal levels. Now, that says to us, look, people are still having to eat and they're still having to drink, but they're not doing it at restaurants. They're going to be doing it at home. It's cheaper. It's so much easier, and you just simply can't go out in some countries because of lockdowns and other restrictions. So what that means is if you're a winemaker in New Zealand, or if you're selling a nice premium cut of meat into a restaurant, you need to pivot your operations to actually meet demand where it is globally. So you need to make sure possibly that you're making slightly different wine or slightly cheaper wine so you can sell it in the supermarket rather than the restaurant. You need to make sure, again, that those fine cuts are trying to make their way into homes, again, at a slightly lower price point, but I'd still be making slightly less money on a nice bit of meat, but selling it than trying to sell it for a high price and having no buyer. So there are those challenges, I think, moving ahead in terms of us exporting to the world. We also need to make sure that we're looking for new markets. There's a lot of focus at the moment in New Zealand on getting good trade deals with the likes of the UK and the European Union and the US, and those are great. They're big markets, but we do a lot of trading with them anyway. There's areas, though, like India, other parts of Southeast Asia, and increasingly Africa, which we will want to be getting into in terms of providing our products into those places. But we've also got to get quite smart about them. I'll give you a quick anecdote around the likes of India. New Zealand's been trying to do a free trade deal there for quite a while, and the issue is we're trying to do what we call a comprehensive free trade deal, put everything in the basket and get everyone to agree on every different sector. Now, India's not quite so much of a fan about comprehensive FTAs because they feel like they lose out on them. But New Zealand sort of keeps pushing this idea. You do wonder if in that sort of scenario, New Zealand's better to sort of find one little niche area, say, payroll systems like Xero or something, to establish a beachhead. You get into India, you figure out how the wider world works from a trade point of view, and then you can spread out from there and talk to other sectors. So again, I don't think we need to radically upend our trade policy or do too much of a change. It's just acting smarter with the challenges that we have in front of us and reacting to those changing environments.
How hard is it to trade with different countries these days in terms of people more, I guess, apprehensive? That's a lot going on in the world. The barriers are up. Everyone's sort of going internal and locking down and just doubling down on their own countries. Or does everyone want to? Obviously, if we open up those trade channels, then it benefits everyone mutually. Or what's the thoughts there?
There are some big challenges moving forward in the trade space. I think even before COVID, you had a bit more of a protectionist sort of stance moving through. And what I mean by that is you had the US who sort of said, well, US manufacturers providing for US consumers. Now, that's all good and well until you realize that some countries are better at some things than others. The reason that New Zealand doesn't have car manufacturers anymore is because compared to Japan, we suck at it. We're not good enough to make any money off it. We are good at dairy. We're good at producing really high quality, high standard food. We're good at making sure we've got the right controls. So I think, moving ahead, it does remain difficult to trade across the world. And there is, like you say, that element of protectionism, people wanting to look after their own patch buy local is being sort of discussed across the world. I think where New Zealand has an opportunity moving forward is that our food, particularly on the food front, is regarded as high quality. Our kiwi fruit, for example, had a roaring trade this year. People were looking for vitamin C to boost their immune system. They saw the good old kiwi fruit, nice high vitamin C content, said, I'll have a bit of that. Over in China, we've seen that milk consumption is going pretty well. You've had some of their top scientists and lawmakers that have said, look, have 300 mils of milk a day. That'll up your immune system. You'll do better because of it. Those sort of challenges, or changes rather, will support some of our food exports, and that's good. The world needs to eat, and New Zealand can provide for them. Again, though, I think on that services side, there's a lot more competition. People are looking for a new way to do business. They're looking for tools that will help them do that. If New Zealand entrepreneurs and sort of technologists can get into that space and find out good ways to support businesses, they'll have an edge to move things forward, because New Zealand at the moment is also trading on a really good reputation. People understand that we've done well through COVID. We've got good leadership. We're a pretty innovative bunch. We need to make sure that we continue to push that and showcase our good ideas.
For sure. I suppose worldwide we're well regarded in the health aspect, but no one's quite talking about the economic aspect globally, I suppose. How do we compare to other countries economically with our response, do you think?
Yeah, I think there's a few elements. I think, look, New Zealand entered this lockdown and the pandemic generally in a pretty good position from a financial standpoint. So we've sort of got enough dollars in our back pocket to support what is this incredible upheaval. New Zealand's debt to GDP ratio was sitting at sort of 20% before all of this. Across the developed world, it was sitting at like 80%. Even Australia, I think, was between 30 and 35. So we sort of have a bit of space. The likes of Japan, I think their debt to GDP is like 200%.
200,
so
yeah.
Yeah, it's an insane amount. So New Zealand can borrow more, and look, we are. We have to pay that back at some point, but let's leave that aside for the moment. It does give us the room to sort of invest in and put money forward. The other big, I guess, difference in terms of how we've responded to the economy compared with other parts of the world is that we did not only go hard and early on COVID-19, but we also went hard and early on the economy. That wage subsidy got out within sort of, a few days of people applying. In other parts of the world, you were waiting literally months to get your government support, which meant that between you applying and you getting that cash, you might have had 2 months where you still had to continue to pay your workers, hoping like hell that the government was going to come to the party. In New Zealand, you got that cash in your hand real quick, and that did save jobs. Now, what you've seen because of that is, one, we haven't had any, massive spike in unemployment like other parts of the world. But also, once we got out of lockdown, and we did go very hard very quickly, but actually spending levels returned pretty well afterwards. Now, that was always going to happen in the sense that you had a bit of a post-lockdown surge. People were cooped up 4.5 weeks, and you wanted that new toaster or similar. You went out and bought it sort of first day you could. So you did have a bit of pent-up demand, but I think what it has shown is that the New Zealand economy has been slightly more resilient. We've been putting more money into the economy. We've been getting a good payoff for it. I think the challenge comes is when we move from what we've got at the moment, which is the response, into that recovery phase, and we start to grapple with some of those bigger issues of, look, if we don't have international migration, how do we bring in the right skilled workers to change or to fill some of the gaps that we've got? How do we make sure that we've got the right amount of workers in the right places? How do we support some of those regional economies where we've got big challenges coming through? Down in Southland, you've got Tiwai, which might be closing. You've got the Glenbrook steel plant that might also be shedding some jobs, and they're talking about closing the Marsden Point oil refinery. Those are big parts of some regional economies that could wipe sort of 5-10% of each of those regions' employment out in one foul swoop. So the challenge becomes, how do we actually make sure that we do rebuild better and we get people into jobs? That's sort of the overriding factor as we move forward is employment, because that means money going into the economy. Money into the economy means more jobs again.
For sure. Has the government or anyone in politics alluded to bringing in skilled workers, bringing in those business-minded people with big bucks behind them to build up the economy again, or even buy their way to have a right to live in New Zealand and help boost the economy, build those jobs back up, and help us out, or it's too early to say yet?
There's been a few bits and pieces around the edges. So we've seen, for example, some filmmakers and such come into New Zealand, particularly into Wellington, to resume some filming and do some post-production on movies and TV shows and similar. So there is, I mean, that's a pretty, makes a fair bit of money. We also pay a lot of money here in New Zealand to support those industries, though. So it's a bit of a toss-up as to how good it is to support jobs. The wider, I guess, one of the wider challenges we're seeing is the likes of the construction sector at the moment. There's a lot of stuff going in terms of shovel-ready projects, people trying to get movement across the economy, building roads, building new hospitals or schools, getting those bits and pieces moving. Now, some of those do require some quite technical skills that New Zealand doesn't have. So there have been exemptions, for example, for transmission gully for the City Rail link in Auckland to get some of those projects moving again. Talking to a lot of businesses, though, there's still, there's a lot of gaps out there, particularly in the likes of the broader agri sector, let's say. Those areas don't have the same number of skilled workers coming through. They are finding it tough to do the same level of economic output, the same amount of work, basically, because they don't have the right people. So what we've been seeing over the last month or so is that businesses have said, look, we now realise that the government isn't probably going to grant us any exemptions. We're not going to have people that come across the border to help us fill these gaps. So we're going to have to figure out another way to do it. Now, this year is probably going to be quite tough. You just can't train a Kiwi up that fast to get things moving. What you will see, though, is that businesses say, look, we'll take on a few young people, we'll take on a few Kiwis, we'll train them up over the next year so that when the year after rolls around, we've got the right people to use the equipment, we've got the right people to drive, the big tractors and similar. So there's a bit of near-term pain because we just can't fill that gap very easily. But moving forward, I think what we are going to see is a greater focus on trying to get Kiwis into the roles that we traditionally haven't got people to fill, and we've instead had to sort of import those skilled migrants from overseas. So some bigger changes coming through to the economy, because one of the big drivers of economic activity across New Zealand really over the last decade has been migration. We've brought in more people, they've brought in money with them, and they've spent that. But actually on a per capita basis, so the amount of money or the amount of output that we actually generate per person, the economy's been relatively flat, or certainly not performing very well. So we sort of need to move away from let's just grow the number of people that buy stuff to being smarter about the money that we earn and where we get it from. Right,
yeah. Shifting our headspace just a little bit to politics, how will a national-led government attack this problem, and how will Labour attack this problem, do you think?
I think there's a lot of focus. Yeah, the big focus from both of them remains around jobs, and you've started to see some policies trickle out from both of them. So far, that's been publicly announced. You've got National that has come out with, I think they called it Job Start scheme, where they essentially will pay or help pay for a worker to get into a role over the next few months. And they've also announced that you could take, I think it was up to $20,000 out of your KiwiSaver to try and start a business. Of course, new businesses are important to get activity moving and to hire people, and with that 20,000 you can also get, I think, up to 10,000 more in terms of tax credits and write-offs and similar. So there's a focus from both parties on jobs. From Labour's side, you've got trying to get people into apprenticeships and training so that people can get things moving again and get the right skills for a new job, as well as, I think it was last weekend or the weekend before, you had the Labour Party who announced an extension to the flexi wage program. So again, it's trying to get private sector businesses to hire more people to get that money going again. What I think we've got to realise as well is that there's sort of two timescales to grapple with here. The first one is the immediate term, sort of the next 2 to 3 years, trying to get people back into employment and off, job seeker support or similar. Now, that will require businesses to be a bit more confident about hiring, and so the government does have to, I think, front up with a bit of cash. Moving forward, though, you do have that more medium-term element of, look, if we've got a bunch of new industries that are springing up, or you have a bunch of people who are in an old industry that's simply not sustainable anymore, how do you get get people into those sort of roles. And so I think the focus on education becomes even more important. One of the interesting changes you've seen throughout the last 3 years in New Zealand is a focus more on that tertiary education space, not just universities, but actually polytechs, industry training providers and similar, who are getting more sort of practical and manual based work for people trying to, I guess, challenge and move forward in what is a very, very different way of doing education and actually providing the skills that we need moving forward.
Yeah, I had a question from a friend of mine. He said he wanted to put this to you tonight. Before all this rolled out, there was all this talk of AI and how they'll replace jobs and how certain sectors will get affected and many people will be scrambling to try and keep up with the technology. How does an event like this affect that issue? Or does it accelerate it, or everyone just takes a deep breath and says, okay, we've got to sort out this health problem and this economic crisis and put that on hold?
I think it's actually the first one, to be honest. I think if anything, it speeds it up, and it's already sped up a number of challenges like that. You're absolutely right. AI and automation is going to come through. We have to be realistic there. I think it's also probably a little bit different than how a lot of people anticipate it. I don't think, within 5 years we're all going to be out of a job because the computer overlords are doing all of the work for us. We've already seen, a lot of automation coming through. Payroll, for example, being done through that, machine learning, data entry, those bits and pieces. What I think we've got to realize is there's some parts of automation that just don't or can't be replaced, or we won't see jobs sort of being taken up. I say that in the sense that, look, if you're looking for a lawyer or someone that you have quite a tricky, complex problem and you need to talk about it with someone, I haven't yet managed to find a computer that can talk to me better than another human being. I try to use Siri on my phone every now and then, and it just doesn't pick up the nuances. So I look at a bit of a silly example, but I think we've got to realize there are some roles that require a real human touch, and they will never be taken over by robots or automation or AI. Those areas are where I think we need to focus on, because that's where human interactions do provide the most value. That also speaks to what I highlighted earlier, which is that focus on the service sector, making sure we've got good wraparound support. That's something that New Zealand is well renowned for, and it's something we can get going moving forward. So I think the automation front, you are going to see it accelerate. During lockdown, we had the likes of online shopping, funnily enough, took a massive boost because it was the only way you could get anything moving. I think I heard New Zealand Post was handling something like 200 parcels a minute at one point, huge volumes of activity. And so the way that people are spending their money has started to shift as well. People looking for a new opportunity, a new way to do business. Those changes are going to come through. One of the big ones that you do wonder about moving ahead in terms of those bigger challenges, and it sort of relates to automation, is what does that mean for our workforces? We've seen over the last few years that people have, actually the last few decades, people have worked more in some of our urban centres, Auckland, Wellington, Christchurch, but even sort of city centres like Whangarei rather than in the wider sort of district around it. Now, what we're going to see, I think, moving forward is actually a little bit of the reverse, that people are going to be much happier to work remotely or, in a whole hour away from work, because we can now operate at home. We have figured out that actually it's a pretty good lifestyle opportunity if you can live outside of the hustle and bustle. You need to get to your meetings once a week. Well, that's fine. You can drive in, but the other 4 days you stick around another part of the country. It's normally a lot cheaper, and it's normally got some pretty cool lifestyle differences there for people. So that remote working and working from home, I do think that actually is a massive opportunity to shift how people, or how and where people work across the country.
Yeah, it's definitely opened up that conversation in a range of businesses, which is pretty exciting, I think. There's just more flexibility, like you highlighted, can live somewhere you actually want to, and have that lifestyle gain, cheaper, all the rest of it. What do you think what was the biggest what was the biggest surprise of all this COVID situation that you saw economically that came across your desk or across your eyes, that you just thought, holy moly? This
I
is
think the
different.
biggest one was realizing that this was going to hit so many different people in so many different ways. So we've done a lot of work, like I said at the start, looking at regional economies. And what was very obvious, sort of within the first week or two, was that this pandemic was not going to hit like normal. We've seen in previous times a lot of people have said, look, different economic crises either hit rural parts of the economy or they hit urban parts of the economy. They hit the North Island or they hit the South Island. What we saw this time, the big question that we had to start to grapple with was, in the short term at least, did your economy have a really strong sector around tourism, particularly international tourism? Or did your economy have a much stronger focus towards the primary sector, particularly food-based stuff? And that has enormous ramifications for how the economy responds. But it also, I think, means that we really do have to realise that different economies will operate in different ways. You look at Queenstown, for example. An incredible amount of economic activity in Queenstown is all due to tourism. That's gone. It's just not at the same level. At the same time, Queenstown was the fastest growing economy over the last few years. It had real momentum behind it. Now, you contrast that with the West Coast region. Now, they have one of the slowest moving economies, but they actually have a pretty similar proportion of their economy wrapped up in tourism. So you've got two areas there, both that have similar drivers of economic activity, but are in very, very different positions. Compare that again with somewhere like Taupō, very strong tourism background, but actually a lot of that is based around domestic tourism, so it hasn't taken as much of a hit. Compare that again with the likes of Otahonga or parts of the Waikato district, or Gisborne, for example, the Tairāwhiti region. Those areas don't have as much international tourism coming through. They do have some very strong primary sector activity. They are the breadwinners of the country. They're the food baskets. They create the milk. They provide the meat. They provide some of our fruit as well. Those sort of areas have actually done relatively well, or at least weathered the storm all right through this. And so the thing that surprised me the most was that this was going to hit different for each and every different person across the country. And I don't think we've sort of grappled with such a varied event for a while. In previous times, we've had something and it has hit the dairy sector, for example. That was sort of easy to isolate. This one is hitting in so many different ways, at so many different times, from so many different directions, that it's actually your head starts to spin, and that's what our head did when we were in lockdown. The head does start to spin to understand what all the interlinkages are, because there's not one big event happening like we've normally had in a crisis. There's so many different parts that are all changing all at once, and I think the speed of it is probably the biggest challenge for us at the moment. When we moved into lockdown, things were moving at breakneck speed, and to be honest, they haven't really shifted. And that speed of the crisis is one of the things that is hard to grapple with, because it means that you're sort of having to fly by the seat of your pants and understand and react in real time.
Yeah, it is complex. There's no individual, no business, no community that hasn't been affected by this thing. It's multifaceted, and you can attack it many ways, and there's no right answer. There's like you were saying, we're making the best of a bad situation. It's going to hurt. How long do you think it'll be until the economy nationally is in a position that we were in prior to all this going down?
Look, we're a little bit pessimistic on that front, but other people call us pessimistic. We're going to be honest. We reckon it's pretty realistic. Yeah. It's probably going to be around about sort of 2023 before economic activity is back to sort of pre-pandemic levels. But
is that if the borders are shut, or is that just normal activity happening?
We're expecting that the borders, we're hoping, if you will, we're expecting or hoping that the borders open sort of mid next year is the thinking, or at least start to gradually open from that point onwards. So we'll have Australia first, and then you'd likely, or we're hoping that we see that expansion move forward. Of course, if they don't open, you're likely to see that economic hit prolonged for an extended period. I think, again, though, that the economy that New Zealand emerges with in 2023 will be different. I don't think that you have tourism that returns to the same level of activity. I don't also think that you'll have international education which reacts the same way. So the challenge is going to be that we might return to the same level of economic activity, but two issues persist. The first one is that we're going to have people in different roles, so the composition will be different. There's also going to be that 3 or 4 year period of lower economic activity. That does mean that we
after
sort of
2023.
Yeah, we're, in our minds, we don't just sort of start rocketing again at that point, because there's been such a rapid change in the economy, such a big structural shift, that essentially the ship just takes a while to sort of turn. And once you've got it on the new direction, you can't just fire up the motors and go 100 miles an hour. You have to sort of slowly rebuild that momentum again. So I don't think it'll be a particularly fast rebound for the economy. Look, I'm happy to be proven wrong on that front. It would make me no happier to be wrong about that. But I think realistically, with the scale of change that the economy will see, the number of people that change jobs and have to be retrained, it's realistic to expect we are going to be in this for the long haul.
Right. And how long will it take to pay back the debt that we've borrowed, or all the cost to this thing, do you think?
Oh, I think it'll be, probably a good generation or two. We're talking at least a decade at the absolute minimum, and there'd be some very, very tough calls to make that happen. I think we've got to realise that it's the right move to do. If we didn't take on debt now, then we would emerge, our younger generations would emerge into an economy that was simply far, far smaller, and without the same job opportunities in later years. But it does also mean that that's a huge amount of debt we are racking up, and essentially that's our pandemic insurance that we've spent out. So if we have another event that comes forward, we have another natural disaster, another economic crisis, another pandemic, or anything similar, we'd have to borrow even more. And so we do want to make sure that we pay that down over time, because it's you and me that are going to pay that, through our taxes and similar moving forward. So the challenge is, I think, to make sure that we spend that money wisely. So, investing in infrastructure and similar is quite good. That gives us a productive asset that we can continue to use into the future, but also making sure that we are focused on what we do in the future. Do we have to change our tax settings? Do we have to, I guess, change the way that we consume different things? Do we have to change the way the economy is structured even more than what the pandemic suggests, to make sure that New Zealand is fit and fighting ready for the future, rather than just sort of sitting on its hands and going, we'll change when we need to?
Right. I know it's hard to compare apples with oranges, and every crisis is different, but how does this compare to like the rebuild of Christchurch after the earthquakes, if we compare crisis?
Stunningly different, and I guess worse in the sense that, again, at least with something like that, you had a bit more of an idea of where the crisis ended and where your response began. Whereas at the moment, we have no idea when this COVID-19 pandemic will actually end.
Right.
Is it going to be a vaccine? Do we just have to accept that COVID will stay with us for an extended period, and that before we hop on a plane, we all have to mask up? What are some of those challenges moving ahead? And I say that because, again, if we look back in history, we haven't really got a rule book for this. The latest one we've really got is the Spanish flu of 1918. That killed 50 million people, and the population of the world was much smaller at that time. And I think, again, we've got to realise that the economy is not this weird abstract sort of concept. It's about you and me. And so if we're having to value the economy and whether or not it's worth saving lives, I think we've possibly missed the point a little bit. So what we're doing at the moment is important. To go back to your main, the actual question you asked of how does this
for dollars. Yeah,
this is so much bigger. I mean, we're taking on, up to $200 billion worth of debt. The likes of the Christchurch rebuild we're talking more the tens of billions of dollars, and that was over a few years. This is $200 billion within the next 4 years or so. So the magnitude is much bigger. Absolutely, yep, huge cost. And again, look, the one that I focus on more is how many Kiwis' lives are upended by this. The global financial crisis was the biggest hit. Like I said, that was 65,000 jobs in total, and that was over 21 months. We're already past that, and it's only month 4. So this is going to get a lot worse before it gets better. And for people, I think the magnitude of the shock hasn't quite set in yet, because there is such huge government support. Again, that's important, but when that eventually ends and we have the economy that stands on its own 2 feet, I think people are going to realise that things are sitting very differently for New Zealand.
Yeah, right. dollars for dollars, because you brought up the GFC back in 2008, how does that compare to now?
Again, I mean, it's difficult to get
different.
a bit of a read on it, but I think, again, one of the things that I look at is how government debt is or how government spending is tracking, because the government's a good sort of bellwether. In good economic times, the government, often has a fair bit of money because it brings in good revenue. During harder economic times, it runs a massive deficit because it's having to pay out so much money in support, and it doesn't have as much tax coming in. If you look at during the likes of the GFC and even the Christchurch earthquakes, the sort of the government deficit was pretty small in comparison to this. I mean, look, as another example, we mapped GDP activity, the amount of economic output across New Zealand from the GFC, and we put it over how we expect COVID to hit. We could barely see a dip. That's how different it was. The GFC really does barely register on the scales compared to this. The events we're likely to see actually are more in line with what New Zealand saw in the sort of the 1980s, as we sort of moved out from that sort of protectionist economic stance under Muldoon out into sort of the free market operations. That's actually when we saw the biggest challenges. That's when we had unemployment that spiked, I think, 11% odd in the early 1990s. That's probably more where we're looking in terms of a more comparable shock, in terms of people are having to structurally change what they do. Industries are going to sort of creak and groan and figure out what size they need to do and what they're going to continue producing. So the effects are far, far greater than any shock we've looked at in living memory. We do have to look back really to the Great Depression to get another read on how bad this is for the economy.
Yeah, right. I guess, interesting times ahead, tough times ahead. Is there any closing remarks that you've got for the masses who might be watching? Just to summarize, what your thoughts on anything from the economy to jobs to just what people's lifestyles will be like in the future? Just to
Look,
wrap
I
up.
think it's going to be really tough for people moving forward, but we've got to remember that we will get through this simply because we have to. I think for businesses, for employees, for employers out there, the big one is a little bit to plan for the worst, but to hope for the best. But also, when planning for the worst, be ready to react. What I think we have found during this pandemic is that things do move quickly, but those with a plan are able to respond much quicker and able to get ready for a bigger challenge in a much easier frame of mind. So if you're a business, I wouldn't wait for another outbreak or for a change in restrictions or for government funding to come on board. Having some scenarios of how you're going to adjust your business moving forward, who you know and who you can talk to get good advice and I guess test that thinking, that will be important. The final bit is, look, outside of all the economic impacts of this, COVID-19 is taking a huge mental toll on people. It's really tough. You've got people who are stressed, they're uncertain, they're out of work. That's challenging. You've got a lot of people who are doing a lot of work under intense pressure to try and keep their livelihoods going, to try and support their families. So I think the last bit of advice is, look, keep talking to people, keep being open, keep discussing the big ideas, because a problem shared is a problem halved.
True that. Absolutely, that mental side is very important. If anyone wants to find you or talk to you about anything, how can they best find you?
Look, the best way is probably on the likes of LinkedIn. I think it's Brad Olsen, NZL. Pretty easy to find me. There you go. You've got it up on screen there. Flick me a message. I'll eventually get back to you. The number of messages and emails and texts has been a lot higher over the last few months, and so I'm still trying to get through them. But look, flick me a message there and happy to have a yarn or answer any questions that people have.
Brad, amazing stuff. You're probably the most formally dressed person on the show, so thank you for that, and really appreciate your time. You're a very intellectually stimulating guy. You know your stuff on the economy, so all the best. I know you're very busy around this time, so hope you keep up the great work. Onwards and upwards.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for coming on the show. We'll catch you later, mate. If you ever need anything from my end, shout out.
Brilliant. Will do, mate.
See you, mate. Brad Olsen, everyone. What a guy. Very intelligent, very capable young man. 23, and he knows all that stuff. it's pretty incredible. Yeah, I'll be back with more guests on the show very shortly. Yeah, just lining them up. I've got uni in the background and global games, so there's a lot to do, but I'll try keep pumping up the lives, because yeah, that you find out some pretty amazing things through these things. Just bringing on all the guests, so hopefully it provides you with a bit of value, and I'll catch you on the next show. Peace. Stay safe, everyone.